This week I received an email from one of our guys. And this is what the heading in the email said. Can hard work buy happiness? New study offers surprising answers. So I was kind of captivated by that. I wanted to know a little bit more about it. So I started to read the article, and the first paragraph read like this. Daniel Markovits, a professor at Yale Law School, pulls back the curtain on one of America's most destructive myths. The harder you work, the happier you will be. In his article, he deconstructs this false narrative of the conception that the more you work, the more you labor, the more money you'll have, and the result will be increased happiness. That should be happier. And he concludes with this statement, which I found absolutely fascinating. He said, "It is simply not possible to get rich off your own human capital without exploiting yourself and impoverishing your inner self." So I had to think about that for a little bit, trying to figure out what this guy was saying. Human capital, exploiting yourself, impoverishing your inner life. And I think this is what the guy was saying. I think he was saying that we're putting so much energy, so much labor, so much work into the pursuit of a false narrative that we are missing the purpose in life. To me, that was profound. So the question I have for us this morning is it really a myth that the harder you work, the happier you'll be? Is that really a myth? Because I think there might be a different answer to it. I think we can find the answer, though, in what Paul has been teaching us in the book of Philippians. We're going to be in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 22 specifically today, but we'll be jumping around just a little bit to really mine for some gold in what Paul is saying to us. We've been examining the leadership standards of Paul. He has got so much to teach us, and inside this letter that he wrote to these people, we're seeing all kinds of truth, all kinds of theology, but we're also seeing him unveil his leadership standards. And so here we remember Paul in prison. He's in prison. He doesn't know whether he's going to be alive or dead, and yet it doesn't slow him down. It doesn't hinder his work. He continues to labor on. He labors on. And he makes an incredible statement, the one that we looked at last week. And he said, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." So let's take a look at this passage again, Philippians chapter 1. "But for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. But if I am to live in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And I don't know which one to choose. But I am hard-pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better for me. Yet to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith." Oh, poor Paul, right? He is just conflicted. He wants to go and he'd be with the Lord, but also he realizes that there's a reason for him to stay, because he knows if he hangs around, he will have fruitful labor. And he sees that as a compelling reason to stick around. So Paul knew that the people he was leading, he knew they needed him. They desperately needed him. They still had a lot to learn. They still had a long way to go in their maturing as Christians. And so he wanted to stick around. And so I thought, he said he's going to have fruitful labor. And I said, what is fruitful labor? What does he mean? What does he mean when he says to stick around, to be here will mean fruitful labor for me? So I mind that a little bit too. So what was his work? What was his work? He already told us what his work was. Earlier in this letter, in verse 16, he said, "I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel." That was Paul's work. In verse 18, he says, "I'm here so that Christ may be proclaimed." That was Paul's work. So Paul knew that to stay, even though he was in prison, would be better. His work, his labor would be fruitful. And so then, we continue to think about what this fruitful labor was. What was this fruitful labor? Now, I think we can agree that fruitful labor means this. It means that there are beneficial results to show from the work that we do. When you go to work in the morning, do you have this idea that what I'm doing is going to have a benefit. There's going to be a gain at the end of the day. Someone is going to benefit from what I do. Maybe I will. Maybe my family will benefit. Maybe a customer will benefit. Paul had this idea that his work was going to be beneficial. And so, this fruitful labor is a metaphor, isn't it? It's a metaphor from farming. Farmer, when he plants his crops in the dirt, he expects that in the spring the crop will come up out of the ground. It'll grow and there'll be crop, there'll be something to harvest that'll benefit him and his family. He has this earnest expectation that something is going to come out of the ground and is going to benefit him. And that's what Paul is talking about. I remember when I was a boy. Anybody raised on a farm like I was? Any farmers in here? Are we all city boys? Farmers? Yeah. I remember working on my grandparents' farm. All right, and we would plow, and then I remember hour after hour sitting on our tractor, pulling a disc, breaking up the dirt. And then I remember planting the corn seed. We had acres and acres and acres of sweet corn. Planting that seed, and I remember with great anticipation watching for that seed to sprout. We would walk through the fields, and is it up yet? No, there it is. And then it would grow, We'd walk through those fields, and we'd wait for the corn ears to, come on the stalks. And then late summer, the stalks would be way above our head, and the corn would be weighing down those stalks. They'd be over because they were so heavy. And we just anticipate that harvest. But that's the way it was when I grew up. We knew we put a seed in the ground, something was going to come from it, and we were going to enjoy the fruits of our labor at the end of the summer. And that's what Paul was doing. He knew that his labor would be fruitful. He anticipated that something would come from it, and it really compelled him to move on. So Paul, just like that hardworking farmer, expected his work to be fruitful. So Paul, laboring on. So I said, okay, for Paul, what was the fruit? What did he expect to have happen? What did he expect to see? And you see that in verse 25. If you want to take a look at that, or I'll read it for you. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all. You all. You must have been a Southerner, I guess. I will continue with you all for two things. For your progress and for the joy in the faith. See, what was Paul doing? He was teaching people. He was teaching men also, wasn't he? Paul was making disciples. That's what he was doing, wasn't he? He was making disciples. That's what every Christian is to do. And he worked hard at it. He labored at it. And it brought him tremendous joy. He was compelled, as all followers of Jesus Christ should be, to make disciples. We remember the last words of Jesus Christ before he departed. You remember Matthew 28:19? What did Jesus say to his men right before he departed? Go into all the world and do what, men? Make disciples. Absolutely. That's what Paul was doing. And that's what we're all to do. Regardless of our profession, regardless of the platform God has given us in our life, we are all to make disciples. And Paul says when you do that, and you labor at it, and you work hard at it, it will bear fruit. And that kind of labor, that brings you tremendous joy. It brings you tremendous happiness. That's why he wrote to the church at Corinth this, because he knew those people, they were laboring away, they were working away, and he wanted to be an encouragement to them. And so this is what he wrote to them. Therefore, dear brothers, you guys are my dear brothers, the same encouragement for you. Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. The work of the Lord is making disciples. The work of knowing this. In other words, he said, you should expect that your work will bear fruit, knowing this, that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. And Paul knew that. He worked diligently, he worked hard. It didn't matter where he was. He worked at making disciples. And what was this whole letter of Philippians about? Joy. He knew that kind of labor was going to bring him tremendous joy. And he labored away regardless of what happened in his life. Like we said last week, he was a guy that if anybody should have been sad, he was sad. He was sorrowful, but yet he was filled with joy because of the work that he was doing, because he knew it was going to bear fruit. So our work, man, in this life should be aligned with Christ's directive to make disciples, because our work has eternal significance, doesn't it? It doesn't matter what you do professionally, right? Our prime objective is to make disciples. And then we do this other stuff. We do our jobs, all right? We don't get sucked down in the quagmire of, of your job. That is what you do to support your family. That's not who you are. Who you are is a disciple maker. And that's what Paul wants us to know. So we align ourselves with that directive, and then our life has eternal significance, and it will bring much fruit, bear much fruit, and bring you joy. As I was preparing for this talk, I read this article I ran across, and listen to the title to this article. Workism is making Americans miserable. Workism, really interesting term. I'm just going to read a little bit to you. Bear with it. Economists of the early 20th century did not foresee that work might evolve from a means of material production to a means of identity production. They failed to anticipate that the college-educated elite, it would morph into a kind of religion, promising identity, transcendence, and community. Work as a religion. Fascinating. They call it workism. It is, this writer says, the gospel of work. The decline of the traditional faith of America has coincided with an explosion of new atheisms. New atheisms. Some people worship beauty. Some people worship political identities. Some people worship children. Some people worship their work. But everybody, this author says, worships something. As workism is among the most potent of the new religions competing for congregants. What is workism? It is the belief that work is not only necessary for economic production, but is also the centerpiece of one's identity, and it is life's purpose. Is your work, your identity, is your work your life's purpose? Paul says, no, it's not. Homo industrious, right? The working man, homo industrious. Chasing that American dream that exhausts men trying to, chase wealth, trying to earn money, trying to have prestige and status. It's exhaustive, isn't it, men? There's nothing wrong with work when work needs to be done, when work is put in its proper perspective. There's nothing wrong with it. However, I think our culture has hijacked the reason for work and set itself up for anxiety and disappointment and failure, right? Work is making Americans miserable because we have the wrong purpose in mind for the work that we are doing. And it's not leading to joy, but rather it's making us miserable. Anybody ever felt miserable when you work? It happens sometimes. So what do we do? What do we do? Here's my suggestion for you this morning. I suggest that every day we intentionally purpose to engage in fruitful labor and work hard at it. Here's what I mean. Every single morning, you ask yourself this question, and I do this. Ask myself, what am I going to do today that has eternal significance? What am I going to do that's in my life today? It's going to make a difference in my life, my family's life, or somebody else that I'm interacting with. What am I going to do? At the end of the day, then I debrief myself, and I'm going to encourage you to debrief yourself also. What did I do today that had eternal significance? What did I do today that produced lasting value? And was my labor today fruitful? Something great come out of it. And Paul says when you do that, that is where you will find real joy. That is where you'll find real happiness. If you work diligently at making a difference that has eternal significance, you will find happiness and you will find joy. So back to our question. Is it really a myth that the harder you work, the happier you will be? No, it's true, isn't it? If we work hard at the right things with the right purpose, we will be happier, won't we, men? Father, we thank you for giving us direction and purpose in our life. Help our labor always, Father, to be fruitful and labor that brings glory and honor to you. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Have a great time at your tables, men.